Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watch One, and thanks for logging on. Today we are partying like it's 1989 with this Rolex Oyster Perpetual Explorer II reference 16570, 40 millimeters in stainless steel. This watch has a serial number that starts with an L, and numerically it's in the 590,000 range, which dates it to roughly 1989, 1 year after the debut of the 16570 generation Explorer II. And I should mention that the 80s were a tumultuous time in the Rolex catalog, with virtually every major model featuring at least a couple of references, including an important transitional. For the Explorer II, the transitional was the 1985 to 1987 16550, and when this model, the 16570, bowed, it incorporated the best of that transitional model's innovations with a couple of new tricks that allowed the 16570 an incredible run from the late 80s through the 90s, the 2000s, and right on to the first couple of months of our current decade. This watch continued to run over parts of 4 decades, and that's a testament to just how right Rolex got it out of the gate. So I want to put the watch on the wrist and talk about the ergonomics and the fit before I launch into a little bit of the historical background and some of the aesthetic and mechanical highlights of the model. So a long-running reference, and ergonomically, anyone who's familiar with a 40 millimeter 5-digit Rolex Oyster case is going to feel right at home here. Now this one is on a NATO strap that lends it a little bit more of a supple fit and makes sizing that much easier, but fundamentally the 40 millimeter 5-digit Rolex Oyster case just wears like a dress watch. It has the feel of a nice formal timepiece, thin, delicate tapered lugs. You can see from the profile just how flat this watch sits on my wrist. Now my wrist is 6 1/3 inches, 16 centimeters in circumference, so it's smallish. But because this watch fits so easily, you can see the span of the lugs isn't challenging my wrist at all. I'm nowhere near the lower limit for this case. You could wear this watch easily down to a wrist of 5 1/2 inches in circumference. Quite compact, but at the same time, vintage Rolex has a lot of personality. Because of the strength of the lines of the case, the bezel, the crown guards, there's really no upper limit to what kind of wrist can wear this. Anytime you've got a vintage Rolex utility watch, especially one with the history of the Explorer II and the reputation of the 16570 with a tritium patina dial, it really punches above its weight. Trust me, no offshore, no Hublot Big Bang is going to outshine this thing. This has serious street cred and serious wrist presence. And part of that is one of the innovations introduced by that famed 16550 transitional generation of the Explorer II. Now, although it only ran from 85 to 87 and preceded this one immediately, the bottom line was it was the first Rolex to feature first Rolex Explorer II, I should say, to feature 2 different dial color options. Now back with the 550, it was either cream or the traditional black. With the 570 that you see here, Rolex featured a higher contrast black oxidized handset on a white dial. So whereas the previous was cream with silvered hands, this is white with black oxidized hands, and the contrast just pops. The same black oxidized treatment applies to all of the indices themselves, so even from an arm's length you have no trouble discerning the time on this watch, whether it's the local hour hand in minutes or you're looking at the 24-hour reference second time zone. And that was another of the innovations of the transitional reference that made its way to the 16570, a second independent time zone. As originally conceived, the Explorer II was like the GMT in that it had a 12-hour hand and a 24-hour hand, but one just served as an AM/PM indicator for the other. They were always in sync. You could never decouple them and set them separately. Whereas on the caliber 3085 of the transitional 16550 and the caliber 3185 that you see on this 16570, you can set the hand separately. Remember, the Explorer II was originally designed for Arctic explorers who might be prospecting for oil, places where the difference between night and day wasn't always clear, cave exploration and subterranean prospecting where you might need an AM/PM indicator. By the 1980s, it was clear that people would prefer the functionality of a true dual time, and so that's one of the important distinctions that Rolex introduced from the mid to late 80s. Now, another nice thing about this watch is that 1989, from our perspective, in 2015, is beginning to look more and more like the threshold for true vintage. And I say that because the world was completely different. The mechanical watch market was completely different in 1989. Back then, you would have trouble finding mechanical watches at most watch dealers. There was still a Soviet Union. Peugeot still sold cars in America. And, as you can see, this watch featured a full tritium luminescent scheme. And the tritium really allows this watch to show its age in the best possible light. And that light reveals an ecru coloration. Now, not all watches will patina to the same degree, and because each individual loomed element is separate from the others, not all of them will patina evenly on a single watch. So to find a watch that has its original dial beautifully patinaed, richly patinaed, and evenly patinaed, it's a real find, and it speaks to the originality, the condition, and in a lot of ways, the one-off desirability of this example, because the patina is so even and the dial is in such excellent shape. With the contrast of the framing black oxidized elements on the hands and the indices, this one pops a lot more than the cream dial. So while the cream dial is well loved by Rolex collectors, for pure visual drama, I love the look of this almost tan saddle colored ecru with the black oxidized surround framing it. It's very dramatic, it's very beautiful, it's got a lot of charm and personality. And it's another reason why I say this watch can punch above its weight in terms of wrist presence. 40 millimeters, but make no mistake, this is a big 40. Another nice thing about it is that the Explorer II featured a less heavily printed bezel on the 570 generation. The cream dial featured what's known as a fat font on the bezel, and with the 570 generation, Rolex pared down the size of the printing just a little bit. Now, these numerals do have both depth and color to them, so they are etched into the bezel themselves. And this lighter, airier, more elegant and delicate look just adds to the overall impact of this watch, making it just that much more suitable for different purposes. It works as a dress reference, and of course, being a stainless steel Rolex utility watch, it works as a sports reference as well. The other nice thing is that there's contrast to it. You can see that the bezel itself features almost a sunburst radial brush pattern. There is brushing on the tops of the lugs, but then on the flanks of the case, including the crown guards and the crown, you see there's high polish to differentiate the watch. And you can see that this watch itself hasn't been polished to death in the aftermarket in its subsequent life after leaving Geneva, because a lot of the hand beveling is still evident on the lugs and the crown guards, and that's the mark of a watch that has led a benign life as an older Rolex. Now, another nice thing about the 16570 was the introduction of a new generation of Oyster Perpetual movement. This watch got the 3185, so you've got a chronometer spec movement at a modern 4 Hz or 28,800 vibration per hour rate. It has the ability to set a second time zone, of course the traditional jump date. It also has a Breguet overcoil hairspring on a free-sprung escapement, so you've got a great degree of durability. You've got resistance to positional variation if you put the watch down on its face, if you put it dial up, if it's sitting on its side on your dresser. You've got thermal resistance if you want to wear this one on a hot day or in cold weather. And that's another nice thing, because this movement endured until the 2000s in the Explorer II reference 16570, because this watch carried over the transitional references use of a sapphire crystal. It's really a vintage Rolex that you can wear like a modern Rolex. There are none of the care and feeding restrictions that you'll find on most vintage watches, where you have to worry about damaging a delicate movement or scratching a plexiglass crystal. You don't get that with the Explorer II reference 16570, but what you do get is the delicate proportioning of the vintage style case, as well as that gorgeous, evenly patinaed black, white, and ecru dial. It's a great combination, so if you're looking for your first Rolex, your first vintage Rolex, or if you're just looking to get into vintage generally, this Rolex Oyster Perpetual Explorer II reference 16570, roughly 1989, is an outstanding example of a starter vintage watch that could also be a revered cornerstone in a collection of timepieces from any brands at any price points. Again, in terms of style, value, and charm, this Explorer II 16570 really punches above its weight. And that's why I think if you're looking for vintage Rolex, or even a first Rolex, this Explorer II is the watch you want.